My name is Daniel Mercer, and as of this morning, I can still say with confidence that I am a field researcher contracted by the state's Historical Preservation Board. I specialize in surveying abandoned structures in remote terrain, documenting their condition, and collecting any archival material left behind. That's the formal introduction, the one I've written 100 times. But none of those past sites ever felt like this one. None of them started with a mountain that didn't want to be climbed. I began the ascent at dawn. The air was cold enough to sting, and the trail looked less like a path and more like the forest's old scar, almost healed over. I'd been assigned to locate a forgotten fire lookout somewhere near the summit ridge. Almost no information existed about it. Just one faded photograph and a brief mention in a discontinued ranger log. That lack of record was exactly why they sent me. Forgotten places are my job. Still, something about this one felt wrong from the moment I stepped off the access road. The silence wasn't natural. It felt padded, hollow, like standing in an old cathedral where the air swallows every echo. Even the crunch of my boots seemed muted, as if the forest didn't want the sound traveling anywhere. I kept moving. The cold pockets of air were abrupt, unnaturally abrupt. One step warm, the next step cold enough to burn my lungs. I radioed base for a routine check. Dispatch confirmed I was clear, asked if I had eyes on the summit yet. I told them not yet, though the tree thinned ahead. They told me to check in every hour. Standard protocol. I clipped the radio back to my harness and continued upward. By late morning the trail steepened. The pines spaced out. The ground turned rocky and uneven, like the mountain itself was growing older with each step. A sudden wind slid down the slope, sharp, metallic. Not the scent of sap or soil. Something colder. Something like rusted tools left in the rain. I forced myself to dismiss it. Minerals, oxidized granite, anything normal. When I reached the ridge, I stopped. Not because I was tired, though I was, but because I finally saw it. Perched near the cliff edge, tall, weather-worn, a skeletal fire lookout tower that should not have survived this long. And yet it was intact enough that it should have been on modern maps. But it wasn't. Someone had erased it. I lifted my binoculars. The cabin atop the tower leaned slightly to one side. The windows were dark. The roof sagged, but the beams and railing were still there, too intact for decades of abandonment. My radio crackled faintly, just a soft hiss. I assumed interference from elevation. I kept climbing. Every step closer made the air feel heavier, like the atmosphere thickened around me. The tower loomed above, its wooden supports bleached pale by decades of weather. The single staircase spiraled upward, broken in a few places but still climbable. I approached the base slowly, narrating into my audio log. The boards under my boots groaned with age, but the sound didn't echo outward. It felt like the tower absorbed it, swallowed it. That's when a strange tension ran through me. I touched the lowest railing. Expected splinters. Instead smooth. Unnaturally smooth, like varnish that should have peeled away long ago. I made a note, placed a small sensor at the base for environmental readings. The device blinked, glitched, numbers jittered, and then it shut off completely. I swapped the battery. Nothing. I checked my phone. No signal, that was normal. But the battery, it dropped from 80% to 0 in the span of a heartbeat. Screen dead. No reboot. I felt irritation first. Field tech fails. It happens. But after a few seconds, the irritation faded, replaced by something colder. It didn't feel like malfunction. It felt intentional. I radioed base again. Dispatch. This is Mercer. Checking in. Static. Then, faintly, copy weak, repeat. I repeated my status. The voice crackled back through the interference, warped at the edges. "You're close." The tone wasn't right. Too careful. Too measured. Dispatch never spoke like that. I asked them to confirm the message. No reply, just static swallowing the channel. I clipped the radio back to my vest and looked up at the lookout again. A cold shiver slid along my spine, slow and deliberate, like the mountain itself had just exhaled on my neck. I had come here to find a forgotten lookout, but standing at the base of the tower, every instinct whispered the same unsettling thought. I hadn't found it. It had been waiting for me. The first step up the staircase felt like testing the surface of a frozen lake. The wood flexed beneath my boot, groaning softly, but nothing snapped. I shifted my weight slowly, listening, waiting for any shift in the structure. When it held, I climbed higher, gripping the railing even though something in me didn't want to touch it again. The smoothness of the wood felt wrong, preserved, intentionally so. Each step gave a different tone, like the tower was vocalizing under me. Low, uneven murmurs that didn't echo down the mountainside but curled inward, pulled into the structure itself. By the time I reached the halfway landing, the wind had changed. The breeze earlier had been sharp and metallic. Now it felt stagnant, stale, like the inside of a crawl space sealed for decades. I paused, letting the radio hang against my shoulder. The air pressed in around me, thick enough that I had to take a deeper breath than usual. I tried calling dispatch again just to stabilize my nerves. The channel crackled, jittering like it was being pinched closed. "Dispatch status update. I'm ascending the tower." More static, then barely audible. "Don't go." The last syllable warped, dragged downward, like the speaker had been pulled away mid-sentence. My stomach tightened. I asked them to repeat, but the channel went silent again. I climbed, not because I wanted to anymore, but because going back down felt worse for some reason I couldn't articulate. The structure loomed above me, each step narrowing the world to the creak under my boots and the shallow whistle of my breath. When I reached the small platform below the cabin door, I stopped. The door itself hung crooked on its hinges, but it wasn't swinging in the wind. There was no wind here. Not anymore. It felt like the air held its breath. The window beside the door was dark, almost too dark. Even with midday light, the interior looked like a void. I clicked on my headlamp, testing the beam against my palm before directing it toward the window. The beam hit the glass and just stopped. No reflection, no glare, no interior lighting up. It was like the glass absorbed the light entirely. My pulse kicked up. I reached out, lightly with 2 fingers. The glass was warm, slightly warm. Sun-warmed? Maybe. But the warmth felt uneven, like a faint heartbeat pulsing underneath. I stepped back, exhaling shakily, then reached for the doorknob. It didn't turn at first. Then it did, too smoothly for rusted metal that had been left alone for decades. The latch didn't stick. The hinges didn't complain. The door simply eased inward, slow and patient, as if it expected me. Inside, dust floated through the beam of my headlamp, drifting lazily. But there was less dust than there should have been. The room smelled faintly of old wood, but not the deep rot of years. More like a cabin that had been closed for a season, just a season, not dozens of winters. My first step inside felt hesitant, not physically but mentally, like I'd crossed a boundary I wasn't meant to cross. The floorboards whispered under me, softer than the stairs, almost delicate. The cabin was small. A desk built into the wall, a narrow bunk, a rusted propane lantern, and old equipment scattered across the surfaces. But something was off. The equipment wasn't completely decayed. A field compass, a cracked pair of binoculars, a logbook, everything dusty, but not fused with time the way abandoned objects normally were. These looked paused, held in place. I walked to the desk, brushing a thin line through the dust with my glove. The logbook lay open to a page marked with a smear that might have been a gloved thumbprint long ago. I leaned closer. The writing was faint but legible. Signal interference worsening. Light seen at Northern Ridge again. Dispatch reports no aircraft in area. Advise closing tower until further. The sentence ended abruptly. Not smudged, not cut off by a torn page. It just stopped mid-line, like the writer had lifted their pen and never touched the paper again. I turned the page. Blank. Another page. Blank. Then, a line, carved through the paper with something sharper than a pen. Not written. Carved. Stay below. My breath caught in my throat. I touched the indentation. Deep, almost gouged. Someone wrote it in desperation. Someone who didn't have time to be careful. Behind me, something shifted. Just a soft sound, like a footstep easing weight onto old wood. I turned, too quickly, and my headlamp flickered, then steadied. The cabin looked the same. Empty. Still. But the air felt wrong again. Thicker. Heavier. Charged. I took a slow step toward the open doorway, just to confirm I wasn't imagining the shift. The moment I reached the threshold, my radio crackled so violently it made me flinch. "Mercer, stop." The voice twisted, rising in pitch like it was being stretched. "You're not alone." I froze. The staircase behind me creaked. Once, very softly. Not the random pop of cooling wood. Not the wind. Something shifting its weight. Deliberate. Slow. I leaned just enough to angle my headlamp toward the stairs. The beam trembled slightly with my hands. For a moment I saw nothing. Just the stair spiral disappearing downward. Then one of the steps, 3 levels below, flexed inward. A depression, as if a foot pressed down. But there was no foot, no shape, just the wood bending, responding to something invisible, something standing perfectly still on the stairs and listening to me breathe. My lungs tightened. Every instinct screamed not to move, not to make a sound, not to acknowledge whatever was there. Then the wood creaked again, a fraction louder, closer. Something was coming up, slowly, carefully, as if matching the rhythm of my breath. The next creak came closer, 1 step higher, slow enough that I felt it before I heard it. The air inside the cabin tightened, pushing against my chest, making each breath feel shallow. Whatever was on the staircase wasn't rushing. It wasn't hesitant either. It was deliberate, testing, listening. I didn't dare speak into the radio. The last transmission from dispatch had twisted into something that didn't sound like dispatch at all. And if I broke the silence now, I wasn't sure what might answer. So I backed up 1 slow step from the doorway, keeping my headlamp on the stairs even as the beam shook. Another step, wood bending inward, still no visible shape. I whispered to myself without meaning to, "Don't come up here." But the tower didn't care what I wanted. The wood flexed again, closer now, maybe 2 steps below. I could almost picture the weight, the mass of something climbing, even though my eyes showed nothing. The absence of a form made it worse. I forced myself to move, not quickly. Every instinct screamed that sudden motion would provoke whatever was below me, but carefully, inching deeper into the cabin. The headlamp beam stretched across the stairwell opening, flickering faintly like it was straining to focus. Then silence. No creak, no groan, just the heavy press of air thick enough to hear. I held my breath. 5 seconds. 10. Then, a sharp pop from the floorboard just outside the cabin door, as if something had shifted its weight off the step and onto the landing. It was right behind the doorway. My pulse hammered so hard I felt it in my teeth. I wanted to turn, shine the light directly at the threshold, but something primal pinned me in place. The sense that if I illuminated the doorway, I wasn't going to like what I found, or worse, I wouldn't find anything at all. I backed away another step. My heel nudged the bunk frame. The soft scrape sounded deafening in the silence. Something on the landing responded with the faintest inhale. Not air moving, not wind, a breath. A slow, patient breath that didn't belong to me. I clamped a hand over my mouth. My headlamp flickered again, dimming just slightly toward the doorway, and I had the sick feeling it wasn't a battery issue. The light was being pulled, drawn, toward whatever waited outside. Then the radio on my vest hissed with a sharp burst of static. The sound ripped through the silence like a knife. "Don't look!" The voice was wrong, stretched thin, like something was pulling it through a narrow opening. I didn't know if it was actually dispatch or something else using the channel. But I listened. I didn't look. The next breath from the doorway came deeper, heavier, almost curious. The air in the room rippled. Not visibly, but I felt it shift across my skin. Goosebumps prickled down my arms. I slid sideways toward the desk, keeping my face angled just enough not to see the doorway directly. My peripheral vision stayed a soft blur. That felt safer. I reached the desk edge. My fingers touched the logbook, still open to the carved warning. "Stay below." But whoever wrote it didn't have the luxury I did. They didn't have something waiting on the landing above. I slowly closed the logbook, not for any practical reason, but because the open page felt too exposed, like a vulnerable spot in the room. My breaths came short and careful. The floorboards between me and the door groaned softly, as if whatever stood there shifted its stance, leaning slightly closer. I swallowed hard. My mind raced through every protocol I'd ever learned. Animal encounters, unstable structures, emergency evacuations. None of them applied to an invisible presence that breathed and walked. I needed an exit. There was only one, and it stood in the doorway. Unless my eyes drifted to the window. I tested the glass earlier. It absorbed light strangely, yes, but it wasn't broken. It looked intact enough to hold my weight for a second or two. But if I pushed it open or broke it, I could climb onto the outer platform and descend from the opposite side. Risky, but staying felt worse. The floor outside the doorway creaked again. Closer, almost inside. The breath that followed was different this time. Lower, closer to my ear than it should have been given the distance. Like it was leaning in, savoring the silence before it broke it. I edged toward the window, keeping my head angled down. My hands pressed against the frame. The wood felt cold this time, not warm like earlier. Dead cold, like something had drained the warmth from the room. I pushed on the window. It resisted at first. Old swelling, old paint. Then, inch by inch, it gave way with a soft, gritty crack. Behind me, a footstep. Inside the cabin. Not on the landing. Inside. My throat tightened so fast I nearly choked on my own breath. I pushed the window harder, forcing it upward. The headlamp flickered again, once, twice, and then steadied, though the beam seemed thinner somehow. I slid one leg through the window frame, boot touching the outer railing. The cold outside felt sharp, real, a shock that grounded me. Another step inside the cabin. Slow, measured. The sound came from just behind my right shoulder, far too close. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I shoved the rest of my body through the window, scraping my arm on the frame as I tumbled onto the small exterior platform. The moment I hit the railing and caught myself, the temperature outside felt drastically different. Warmer than inside by several degrees. Felt like stepping out of a freezer. I looked back into the cabin, but only for a second. The interior was dark, still, silent, too silent. Not empty silent, expectant silent, like something inside was waiting for me to look directly at it. I turned away quickly, gripping the railing with both hands as my heartbeat pounded up into my throat. The wind returned, finally, blowing across the ridge in a steady, natural breath. Felt like waking up, like the mountain exhaled again, relieved I had stepped back outside its hidden chamber. But the moment I touched the first step of the exterior ladder, something inside the cabin moved. Not a footstep, not a creak, something faster, sliding across the floor with intent, closing the distance to the window far too quickly to be human. The sound inside the cabin didn't stop. It slid, fast, like something dragging its weight across the floor toward the open window I just escaped through. The motion wasn't clumsy. It wasn't frantic. It was controlled, almost efficient, like whatever was inside had been waiting for the moment I turned away. I gripped the exterior ladder with both hands. My boots found the first rung. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes locked on the wooden rails as the wind pushed lightly against my shoulders. Every instinct screamed at me to move, slowly enough not to slip, but fast enough to stay ahead of whatever might reach the window. Then the window behind me thudded. Not slammed, just closed. Firmly, quietly, like a hand had eased it shut from inside. The sudden silence that followed was worse than the noise. The mountain wind rushed around me, but it felt distant, muffled, as if the tower itself controlled what sounds passed through its frame. I took the second step down, then the third. Each rung trembled slightly, not from my weight, but as if something inside the structure resonated with each movement. When I reached the midpoint of the ladder, my radio crackled again, soft, unsteady. "Mercer, come in." The voice was faint but human, too human. I hesitated, breath held tight. "Where are you?" I lifted the radio slowly. The wind hummed through the tower beams behind me. "I'm descending the lookout," I whispered, keeping my voice low like the tower might react if I spoke too loud. I had interference. Something's inside the structure. Static washed through the speaker. Copy. Don't descend The transmission sliced off mid-word. I whispered, "Dispatch, repeat. You're cutting out." Only static answered. But beneath the static, if I listened carefully, there was something else. Not words, not breathing. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers brushing against a microphone. I muted the radio. The next rung creaked under me, but I didn't stop. I forced myself downward, hand over hand, the wooden frame scraping against my gloves. When my boots hit the final rung, I took a steadying breath. The ground was only 6 feet below. I braced my legs and dropped lightly onto the uneven dirt. For 2 seconds I felt relief. Then the tower shuddered. Not from wind, not from age. A pulse. Like something heavy had shifted its weight inside the cabin and the entire structure responded, beams tightening with a groan that traveled down to the soil. I backed away fast, my boots crunching against the brittle grass near the base. My headlamp beam swept up the tower's height and caught nothing in the windows. They were black, flat, absorbing the light like before. But I wasn't imagining it. Something was up there. Something that moved with intent. I forced myself to breathe. I needed distance, perspective, plan. I circled the base, heading toward the tree line where the canopy thinned enough to keep the lookout in view. Halfway there, my foot kicked something buried beneath the pine needles. A dull metallic thunk. I crouched, brushing away the debris, revealing the corner of a rusted metal box. Military surplus style, the kind used for field equipment decades ago. I tugged it free, expecting the hinges to be fused shut. Instead, the lid opened with almost no resistance. My stomach tightened. Inside were items that shouldn't have survived the weather this long. a flashlight with tape around the handle, a map of the ridge, edges crisp, ink unfaded, a folded note sealed in a plastic sleeve, a compass that spun slowly all on its own, not stopping on any direction. The note was the only thing that drew my focus. I slid it out carefully and unfolded it. The handwriting was jerky, uneven, like it had been written by someone whose hand wouldn't stay still. If you made it down, don't follow the main trail. Don't go back the way you came. It watches the ridge. It waits for movement. Stay in the trees. Do not let it see your descent. My pulse kicked hard. I read it again just to be sure. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't misunderstanding. Someone had written this down here at the base, meaning they had made it out of the lookout alive, at least long enough to leave a warning. I looked up. The tower stood motionless, but it felt like it was staring down at me. Not the structure itself, but something inside, watching through the glass that refused to reflect light. A faint sound drifted down the beams, metal tapping lightly, like footsteps brushing against the inner frame. Slow, measured, exploring. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket. My eyes stayed locked on the tower as I stepped back toward the trees. Then the radio clicked. Not static, not a voice, just a single, crisp click, like someone tapping the transmit button deliberately. I froze. A second click came, then a third. 3 evenly spaced taps, mimicking something, calling something, or signaling. My own breath felt too loud. I turned the radio off completely, sliding it deep into my vest as I moved into the treeline. Branches brushed my shoulders. The shadows here were softer, natural. The wind felt freer, less constrained by the weight pressing around the tower. But as soon as I crossed into the trees, the lookout groaned again. Louder this time, the whole frame tightening like an animal bracing to move. Then, a sound I hadn't heard before. A long, low exhale. Not the wind, not the structure. A breath. A breath coming from the cabin above. Slow, deep, aware. I didn't wait for whatever followed. I started down the mountain. Not the trail, but the slope the note had pointed toward. Keeping my steps light, my heartbeat quiet, and my eyes fixed on the spaces between the trees rather than the tower itself. I didn't want to see if something stepped out onto the platform, and I didn't want to know if it was looking directly at me. The slope immediately below the lookout wasn't meant for descent. It was uneven, cluttered with loose rock, scattered roots, and steep dips that forced me to choose each step with care. But the trees closed around me, sheltering me from the tower's direct line of sight, and that alone pushed me forward. The air down here felt different, still cold, still thin, but natural. No more heavy pressure squeezing my lungs. I glanced back only once. The lookout stood still against the sky, a dark silhouette perched on its spindly legs. No movement in the windows, no figure, no shifting shadow. But the silence around it wasn't right. It was too expectant, too focused. I could almost feel the weight of attention pressing down the back of my neck, tracking me even without visible eyes. I moved deeper into the trees. The note's instruction echoed in my mind. Stay in the trees. Don't take the ridge. Don't let it see your descent. Whatever it was, the person who wrote the warning had understood it well enough to fear its vantage point. That alone told me following the old trail back to the access road was no longer an option. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. I froze. My breath caught halfway in my throat. It wasn't loud, just a small, crisp break. But it came from the direction of the lookout. Something had moved. Something large enough to shift weight onto a dry limb until it cracked. I crouched and scanned the trees. My headlamp cut narrow cones of cold white across the forest floor. The fog rolling between the trunks made the beams look bent, like the light itself didn't want to go straight. Nothing, No shape, no outline, but something had followed me off that tower. I pushed forward, deliberately slower. Running would be suicide on terrain like this. One wrong step meant a broken ankle and no radio support. My muted radio sat heavy in my vest. Turning it on felt dangerous, like opening a doorway when I already knew something was on the other side. I descended another 20 yards before noticing something odd in the ground patterns. The layer of soft needles and dirt bore no signs of recent travel. No boot prints, no animal trails. Even the local wildlife seemed to avoid this stretch of forest. Except for one shape, a single, long depression in the soil, not round like a hoofprint, not split like a deer track, a smooth, elongated oval that pressed deeper at one end and shallower at the other. A footprint, if you could call it that, made by something heavy that didn't step like a person or a four-legged animal. I knelt beside it. The deeper end pointed downhill, toward the direction I was headed. But the soil around the print was undisturbed. No slide marks, no scattered dirt. It was as if the thing had pressed down with impossible precision. Lowered itself, lifted straight up. No shifting weight. I stood quickly and kept moving, forcing my breath to stay steady, even though the chill in my spine spread like someone pressing cold fingers along each vertebra. The forest thickened ahead, offering more cover. I moved toward it, using the denser branches as a shield. The air here smelled stronger of sap, pine resin, and something else, an undertone like burnt dust. Then a faint tapping sound drifted through the trees. Not close, but not far. 3 taps. Even. Deliberate. My hand slid toward my vest instinctively. The radio, still muted, felt warm against my chest, like it had been activated even though I'd turned it off. I didn't unmute it. Instead, I pushed deeper into the trees. As I weaved between trunks, the terrain opened into a slanted clearing where the tree roots twisted outward like exposed veins. Downed branches lay scattered, forming natural cover. But something about the clearing stopped me. The trees here were scarred. Long, shallow gouges in the bark, spaced evenly at shoulder height. Parallel lines as if something had scraped its claws or fingers or instruments across the trunks as it passed through. The grooves weren't random. They made a subtle curve and arc through the trees. A path not made by people. I didn't want to follow it, but avoiding it meant turning toward the ridge, and the ridge meant being visible from the tower again. I took the path. Each groove in the trees pointed the way, leading me downhill in a slow, precise arc. The forest floor dipped and rose, but the line continued unbroken. Too smooth, too intentional. After 10 minutes, the tapping returned. This time closer. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. It mimicked the earlier signal perfectly. I clenched my jaw. My boots pressed quietly into the forest bed. I allowed myself one glance back. Nothing. Just fog between the trunks. Then the fog shifted, subtly, like something large had moved behind it, disturbing the air in a single smooth motion before going still again. My heart thudded hard once, a tight punch against my ribs. I moved faster, but the forest ahead opened suddenly into another clearing, this one larger and flatter, with old camp remnants scattered around the edges. I hesitated at the boundary. Fabric scraps, a broken canteen, a length of rope knotted around a fallen limb. All weathered but not ancient. Someone had camped here, more than once. Not recently, but not decades ago either. At the center of the clearing lay a fire ring filled with cold, packed ash. No footprints, no signs of struggle. Just a dead campsite in a place no one should have camped. A scrap of laminated paper lay wedged beneath a stone. I crouched and pulled it free, brushing away the dirt. It was part of a topo map ripped into a rough triangle. Someone had circled a point on the ridge. The same ridge the note told me not to use. Beside the circle, in faint, rushed handwriting, "Don't let it track you above the trees." My throat tightened. That meant someone else had been hunted. Down here, in the forest, by something that used elevation to see. A soft rustle brushed through the trees behind me. Not wind, not animal. A single, deliberate shift of weight. I stood slowly, careful not to make a sound. The tapping returned, so faint it felt like it came from inside my skull this time. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Then a new sound. Soft. Dragging. Something moving across bark. Not toward me. Above me. I lifted my eyes just slightly. Just enough to see the dark outline of a shape on a tree trunk. Not climbing. Not perched. Pressed against the bark like a shadow trying to flatten itself, as if deciding whether I had seen it. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I just lowered my gaze again, pretending I hadn't noticed. Then the shape shifted, slowly peeling away from the tree, silent except for the faintest stretch of wood. I turned toward the deeper forest, and walked, not running, not rushing, because whatever it was, followed movement. I kept my pace steady, counting each footfall like the rhythm might keep my nerves from unraveling. The trees ahead grew denser, closing in overhead until only narrow strips of gray daylight slipped through. Behind me, the forest remained painfully quiet. Too quiet. Even the soft drag across the bark had stopped, which didn't comfort me. It meant it was moving silently now. The path curved slightly left, following the gouged lines in the bark. The scratches grew shallower here, less frantic, almost casual, as if whatever created them wasn't hiding. It was simply marking the route it preferred. That realization made my chest tighten. I wasn't following a human trail. I was following something else's. The ground sloped sharply. I had to brace myself on a trunk to descend without sliding. My fingers touched the bark, and I jerked them back immediately. Warm. Not sun warm. Body warm. The warmth pulsed faintly beneath the wood, like the tree itself held a trapped heartbeat. I stepped away from it fast, wiping my hand against my pant leg, trying not to imagine what it meant. The trees weren't natural anymore. The air wasn't natural. This entire side of the mountain felt altered, shaped by whatever lived here. I moved quickly now, careful but urgent. The forest pulse faded as I put distance between myself and the warm trunk, replaced by a soft hum vibrating through the ground. Not electrical, not mechanical, something alive. The same hum I'd felt beneath the tower. Branches brushed my jacket. Pine needles fell in slow cascades. The air grew humid, almost sticky. Somewhere ahead, water murmured. A stream, maybe. A good sign. Streams meant lower elevation, meant escape routes, meant the chance to orient myself. I pushed toward the sound. The forest opened suddenly into a narrow ravine, carved by a shallow creek trickling over smooth stones. The water looked clear, normal. I crouched near it, letting the cold seep into my hands, grounding me. My heartbeat slowed just a little. Then I heard it again. 3 taps. Soft, measured, coming from the ridge above the ravine. I didn't look up. Instead, I slid down onto the lower bank, letting the overhang of rock disguise my movements. The creek bed here curved enough to hide my silhouette. I pressed myself against the cool stone and listened. The tapping stopped, but the forest didn't return to silence. A faint rustle drifted across the ravine, branches bending, not snapping. Something moving along the ridgeline, pacing, searching, not clumsy like a bear or cautious like a cougar, purposeful, slow, intelligent. I reached for my radio even though I knew it was pointless. My thumb hovered over the switch. Turning it on might attract it. Leaving it off meant no backup. I chose the lesser danger. The moment the radio clicked alive, static hissed out, loud, harsh, cutting the air like a blade. "Mercer, you need to break line of sight. Do you copy?" The voice warped mid-sentence, stretched thin like it was passing through something it shouldn't. I whispered, "I'm in a ravine. Something's tracking me." Static washed over the next words. Then, "It sees movement. Stay low. Don't let it." The radio cut out. Not lost signal. It cut out exactly when the forest above me went silent again. I pressed closer to the rock, breath held so tight my ribs ached. The creek gurgled quietly, the only sound that felt normal. A shadow shifted along the ridgeline. Not a figure, not an animal, a shape without edges, like darkness thickening between the trees, then thinning again. I stayed perfectly still. Seconds stretched. Then, as if deciding something, the shadow peeled backward into the tree-line and disappeared. My breath came back in a sharp rush. The radio remained silent. The forest eased just slightly, the air feeling less compressed. I climbed downstream now, staying low, using the ravine walls as cover. The forest dimmed as clouds rolled overhead, casting everything in a pale, muted gray. My boots slipped on wet stone, but I caught myself before falling. After 5 minutes, I noticed the creek widening. Not naturally. Someone had built a rudimentary dam years ago. Logs stacked in a crosshatch pattern, rope rotted away but still holding the shape. A structure built by human hands somewhere no one should have been camping. Beside the dam sat a collapsed shelter, just a ribcage of branches now, overgrown with moss. But it hadn't fully returned to the earth yet. Couldn't have been more than a few years old. I approached carefully. On the ground near the shelter lay a metal thermos, dented and coated in sap. I turned it over. A name scratched into the side. Bro. My stomach dropped. I had seen that name before in one of the unsolved disappearance lists connected to this mountain. A solo hiker who'd vanished on a route far from this ridge. The search logs mentioned last known time uncertain, as if his signals had been scrambled just like mine. Inside the shelter, half buried in dirt, something else glinted. A handheld radio, cracked, completely dead. The battery compartment bent outward, like something had pried it open with force. Next to it, a waterproof notebook lay wedged beneath a stone. I pulled it free and flipped it open. Most pages were blank or smeared with water damage. But halfway through, one entry remained intact. Don't look at it when it moves. It doesn't like being seen changing shape. It only approaches when your back is turned. If you hear the tapping, stay still. If you hear it breathing, run. I stared at the page until the words blurred. Then, a breath behind me. Soft. Close. Too close. I didn't turn. I didn't breathe. I didn't move a single muscle. The breath came again. Slow and steady. Right over my shoulder, warming the back of my neck. My vision pulsed at the edges. My heartbeat thudded loud enough that I prayed it wouldn't hear it. Then, something tapped the ground beside my boot. 3 slow taps. Waiting. Expecting movement. I swallowed, barely, the motion tight and painful. The breath deepened, hovering at the edge of skin and air. I stayed perfectly still, and whatever hovered behind me leaned in closer. The breath behind me stayed steady, far too calm for something stalking prey. It wasn't panting. It wasn't excited. It was controlled, almost studying the rhythm of my inhale and exhale like it was trying to learn it. The heat of it brushed the back of my neck, raising a slow wave of goosebumps down my arms. The forest around us had gone still. Even the creek seemed to quiet itself, as if the entire mountain held its breath to see what I would do next. I didn't move. Not because I was brave, because I knew if I did, it would react. and I didn't know how fast it could react. Judging from the way it had slid across the lookout floor and appeared behind me without a sound, it could likely cover the distance between us in less than a second. The tapping at my boot, 3 slow taps, echoed like a countdown. But it wasn't counting down. It was prompting, testing me to see if I'd step, flinch, look, respond. I didn't. Seconds stretched, bleeding into each other. Sweat slid cold down my spine. The breath behind me shifted barely, tilting from the back of my neck to my left ear. The warmth feathered across my cheek. It was close enough that if I turned even slightly, my forehead would brush whatever hovered inches from my face. I clenched my jaw. My teeth buzzed with tension. Then, just as slowly as it had come, the breath pulled away. Not stepping back, not retreating, just retracting like something withdrawing a limb or leaning away to observe from a new angle. A soft rustle followed, pine needles shifting. I listened hard, trying to pinpoint distance. But it wasn't moving away. It was circling, slowly, quietly. Each shift of debris on the ground was lighter than the weight I'd heard on the lookout stairs. A different kind of movement, more careful. I kept my head lowered, eyes aimed at the dirt. That was when I noticed something. My shadow was wrong. The light from my headlamp cast a faint shape on the ground in front of me, stretched slightly from the angle. But it wasn't alone. A second shadow, thin, elongated, touched the edge of mine. Not human-shaped, not animal-shaped, more like a smear, a silhouette stretching and narrowing as if the light couldn't decide where its edges were. The smear shifted again, slowly, as if tilting its head. My lungs tightened. I bit back the urge to gasp. Then a branch snapped somewhere deeper in the trees. Not behind me, downstream. Something large. Intentional. The shadow beside mine stilled instantly, as though freezing to listen. Another snap followed. Closer this time. 2 things moved in these woods. Not one. The smear shadow leaned forward slightly, like it was scenting the air, gauging whatever approached. And whatever approached was heavy, measured, not stealthy at all. A low thrum vibrated through the soil beneath my boots, the same hum I'd felt in the lookout. But this one felt deeper, like it came from the mountain itself rather than the structure. The smear shadow retracted further, pulling away like a tide retreating from shore. The warmth behind me faded completely. The tapping stopped. The forest held still as stone. It wasn't focused on me anymore. Something else had its attention. I took my chance. My legs felt like wet sand, but I forced them to move, slowly at first, shifting weight so gradually the dirt barely noticed. When no breath pressed back against my neck, no tapping came at my heels, I eased forward another step. The shadow smear slid backward, thinning, stretching, almost dissolving into the underbrush. I didn't question it. I moved. I ducked into the thicker part of the ravine, letting branches scrape my shoulders and arms, welcoming the sting. They were real, physical, grounding. I followed the creek's curve until the noise from behind grew faint. The heavy footfalls continued, rhythmic and deliberate, but they were heading toward the shelter I had just left. Whatever lived here, they weren't allies. They weren't companions. They were competing predators. My breath shook as I scrambled farther downstream. The ground dipped sharply, forming a narrow chute of rock. I slid down it, boots scraping against moss-slick stone, catching myself on roots. The creek widened again into a shallow pool rimmed by ferns. The air here felt clearer, less charged. Enough that I dared to unmute my radio. Static burst out, loud enough to make me flinch. Mercer. The voice was urgent now, frayed at the edges. You need to get off the north face. Do you hear me, off the north face? I whispered. Copy. Something's tracking me. The static deepened. The voice fractured. We see movement on the ridge. That's not you. Stay in cover. Before I could respond, the radio screeched with distortion. High, sharp, like metal twisting. I dropped to my knees, covering the speaker with my hand to muffle the noise. Then, through the distortion, it's coming down. 2 signatures. You're between them. 2. I was right. I wasn't dealing with one creature. There were at least 2, and I was directly in the path between them. My head spun. The ravine, the ridge, the creature at the shelter. It wasn't random. They were funneling me, hurting me, each one cutting off a route of escape until I'd be forced into a dead end. Unless I found a path they didn't expect. I scanned the area, heart pounding. On the far side of the pool, a narrow opening between boulders caught my eye. A tight squeeze, but passable. Beyond it, the land sloped downward into thicker vegetation. Cover. I gathered every ounce of strength and moved, half crawling, half running across the wet rocks. The forest behind me erupted with noise. Crashing branches, heavy footfalls, the rippling hum that signaled one of them was near. I didn't look back. I shoved myself between the boulders, scraping my shoulders, tearing fabric as I forced through the narrow space. The stone walls felt cold and damp, pressing in around me like a throat closing. The moment I emerged on the other side, the forest seemed to change. The air cooler, the trees older, their trunks wider and twisted. A faint trail lay ahead, not made by humans, but by something moving regularly through this grove. I had no choice. I followed it. And behind me, something slid into the ravine, breathing deep, deliberate, and hungry. The trail, if it could even be called that, wound tightly between ancient trunks that twisted like skeletal ribs overhead. The deeper I moved into this grove, the stranger the air became. Cooler, yes, but also charged with a faint vibration, like the mountain hummed through the soil. My steps felt lighter, almost buoyed upward, as if the earth wanted me to keep moving. Behind me, the sound of something massive slipping into the ravine sent a wave of pressure rippling through the trees. A deep, resonant thud followed, the impact of weight, not a fall. Whatever it was, it had landed on purpose, controlled, and it was close. I crouched low, forcing my breath to stay steady. The trees here grew so densely that my headlamp beam fractured into thin slivers, scattering across the bark like broken glass. Each flicker looked like movement, and each piece of movement made my pulse hammer. I needed distance, but the mountain wasn't giving me distance. It was narrowing my world with every step. A low creak echoed from the ravine, followed by a second. 2 steps. Heavy. Slow. Something was climbing out. I ducked behind a moss-covered log, easing my body into the shadow beneath its curve. The ground smelled of wet rot and old pine, grounding me just enough to keep myself from shaking. Then came the sound I dreaded most. 3 taps. Soft. Measured. Not far behind me, the second creature. I shut my eyes, forcing myself still. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint, deliberate inhale. The air behind me warmed again, just for an instant, brushing my ear like a whisper without sound. The warmth pulsed once, then withdrew. It wasn't focused on me. Not yet. It was listening. Above the ridge, branches exploded in a violent snap as the heavier creature dragged itself free of the ravine. The 2 predators were triangulating. I was the center point of a hunt. I slid from under the log, staying low, letting the roots disguise my outline. The grove ahead angled downward into a shallow hollow thick with ferns and fallen debris. A natural blind. If I could reach it, I'd have cover, if not escape. But halfway there, my foot hit something hard beneath the ferns. I froze. Slowly, I brushed aside the leaves. A rusted metal sign lay half-buried in the soil. White Hollow Lookout. Service road closed permanently. January 1978. My breath caught in my throat. This was the same tower I had been sent to survey. But White Hollow wasn't on any map. No record. Nothing. And a service road that had supposedly closed nearly 50 years ago shouldn't have left a sign this intact. Someone or something had preserved it. Beyond the sign, the ferns hid a cluster of other objects. An old thermos, a cracked compass, a torn backpack strap. A scatter of belongings concentrated in a small radius like debris collecting at the center of a whirlpool. Something funneled everything here, or dragged people here. I backed away slowly, fighting the burn in my legs as they begged to run. Running was death. Movement was invitation. Branches rustled behind me. A weight shifted. Then the softest exhale reached my neck again. No warmth this time. Cold. Almost frostbitten. I turned my head a fraction of an inch, no more. A silhouette clung to a nearby trunk. Thin. Distorted. Flattened against the bark like a shadow peeling away from its surface. Its limbs were too long. Too smooth. They bent not at joints but in gradual arcs, like wet cloth draped over invisible frame. It watched me, not with eyes, with absence. Its face a blank plane that seemed to drink in the light around it. I swallowed a tremor. Before it could move, a guttural thud shook the grove, the heavier creature advancing through the trees. The ground quivered beneath my boots. The shadow thing's head, or the place where a head should be, tilted toward the noise, its posture stiffening. Two predators, hunting the same ground. Not allies, competitors. A thick branch snapped behind me, the heavy one closing in fast. The shadow clinging to the tree hissed, a sound like wind squeezed between two stones. Then it peeled away from the bark, stretching toward the hollow as if retreating to secure its own claim. I saw my chance. Not safe, not smart, but my only chance. I slipped down into the hollow, crawling on all fours to stay beneath the cover of the brambles. Dirt smeared across my gloves. Roots tore at my jacket. I slid between two fallen logs, letting the darkness swallow me. The heavy creature's footsteps entered the grove seconds later. Deep, spaced too far apart to be human. Each step accompanied by a faint hum. Low, resonant, vibrating in my chest like a distant engine buried in the earth. The shadow creature moved too, but high, fast, threading through the upper branches with unnatural grace. Two hunters circling the same basin, searching, testing each other's territory just as much as hunting whatever lay below. Me, the heavy creature inhaled. A long seismic pull of air that rattled the hollow. Leaves trembled. The trees creaked. The sound made every part of my body want to recoil. Then, the shadow thing shrieked. Not loud, not piercing, but wrong, like a sound meant for a place with different air, different atmosphere. The branch beneath it split as it lunged sideways, fleeing the heavier predator's advance. The forest erupted in kinetic silence. Motion everywhere, sound nowhere. I curled beneath the logs, clutching the earth. Then something new happened. A vibration pulsed through the soil. Slow, rhythmic, almost like footsteps. Except it wasn't coming from either creature. Came from deeper, lower, inside the mountain. 3 pulses. A pause. 3 pulses again. Like the mountain itself was answering their tapping signals. My radio clicked on by itself. No static. Just a voice barely above a whisper. Mercer, do not let them corner you. They're pushing you toward the hollow entrance. Do not go inside. Inside? My chest tightened. I hadn't seen any entrance. Just dirt. Leaves. Roots. Then, beneath my palms, a breath of cold air drifted upward through the soil. There was an entrance, a hidden shaft, right under me, and the creatures were herding me toward it for a reason. The air rising through the soil felt impossibly cold, like standing above an open freezer door, except the mountain itself was exhaling. I froze, palms pressed against the dirt, feeling the faint pulse of something deep below. The hollow beneath me wasn't just a gap in the earth. It was breathing, alive in a way no place should be. Above the logs, branches snapped. Heavy footfalls shook the grove as the larger creature moved closer. The smaller shadow thing darted through the canopy, its movement a smear of darkness slipping between branches, trying to reposition. Their pacing wasn't random. Their circling wasn't random. They weren't just hunting me, they were funneling me toward the hollow, toward the breathing mountain. I pressed my chest against the dirt, listening. The underground pulses repeated. 3 thuds. A pause. 3 thuds again. The mountain was answering the creature's tapping. No commanding it, or synchronizing with it. I didn't want to think too hard about the implications. My radio whispered again, faint as dust in wind. Mercer, if you're hearing this, do not go down. They don't go down there unless the mountain is feeding. Feeding. The word hit like ice water. I tried to move away from the hollow, pushing against the soil, but the ground sank slightly beneath my weight. A soft hiss of cold air escaped upward, brushing my face like the mountain had detected me. Above, the heavy creature stopped walking. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. Then a deep inhale rattled the grove, an inhalation so slow and so massive that the leaves trembled. The shadow thing froze in the branches. Even it feared the bigger one, or obeyed it. I crawled sideways, inching toward a cluster of roots that might hide me better. But the moment I shifted, the soil beneath my knee cracked softly, just a hairline fracture. Both creatures reacted instantly. The heavy one turned, a seismic shift of weight. The shadow thing tilted its blank head toward me, limbs unfolding like wet fabric. I flattened myself to the earth. My heartbeat hammered so loudly I prayed it didn't give me away. The larger creature stepped toward my hiding place. One step, another. The ground vibrated so deeply that dirt sifted over my arms. I tasted iron when I breathed. The shadow thing dropped silently from the branches, landing only yards away. Its shape elongated, narrowing, then compressing as if adjusting itself. They weren't fighting each other anymore. They were aligned, coordinated, and the hollow beneath me pulsed again, slightly stronger. The soil warmed for an instant, then chilled, like the mountain itself recognized fresh prey above. Couldn't wait. I moved, not up, not sideways, forward, directly beneath the tangle of roots. A tight, narrow crawl that scraped my back and jammed branches against my ribs. I didn't care. Anything to avoid being forced into the hidden shaft. The heavy creature reacted with a roarless exhale. No sound, just force. A blast of moving air that sent leaves spiraling. It lunged. The shadow thing darted, stretching into a line of darkness. I ducked deeper under the roots as a massive limb, or something limb-like, slammed into the ground where I'd been a heartbeat before. The impact sent a shockwave through the hollow. The pulse beneath me shuddered, then intensified. The mountain was waking up. I dragged myself farther, lungs burning. My jacket tore on a jagged root. Dirt packed under my nails. Behind me, a slicing sound cut through the air, like something long and smooth carving into earth as the creatures tried to reach me. Ahead, light, faint, fractured light bleeding through the trees. An opening. I pushed harder, ignoring the sting of bark against my skin. The hollow beneath me pulsed again, harder, as if trying to pull me downward. The soil shifted, collapsing slightly beneath my hips. No, 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 I whispered, clawing forward, refusing to be swallowed. The shadow thing shrieked softly. Closer now, its limbs slipping through the roots only inches behind my ankle. It brushed my boot, cold as ice. I kicked instinctively, my heel striking something soft that yielded without bones. It recoiled. I surged forward. My head burst through the roots into open air. I crawled out, gasping, rolling onto a slope that descended sharply into thicker forest. Behind me, the heavy creature tried to force itself under the roots, but the hollow pulsed again, stronger than before. The soil collapsed beneath it like a trapdoor giving way. The creature dropped with a seismic thud deeper into the earth, its weight shaking the ground. The mountain accepted it. The shadow thing shrieked again, this time with fear, scrambling backward as the hollow widened. I staggered up, half running, half stumbling down the slope. The forest blurred into streaks of green and gray. Branches tore at my arms. My boots slid on loose soil. The mountain pulsed once more, this time a full, deep tremor. A warning, a hunger, a claim. Behind me, the shadow thing retreated into the higher trees, unwilling to go near the newly opened cavity. The heavy creature didn't reappear. The ground swallowed it whole. I didn't stop running until the forest thinned and a sliver of the old access road appeared between the trunks. Cracked asphalt, faded paint, real human-made structure. Salvation. I staggered onto it, collapsing to one knee, lungs scraping for air. The radio clicked softly. "Mercer, are you out?" I lifted it with shaking fingers. "Yes," I gasped. "I'm on the service road. I'm—" A pause. Then the voice came back, steady, relieved, too relieved. "Good. Stay where you are. Do not go back into the trees. Retrieval team en route." I exhaled, letting my head fall back. But then, from the forest's edge, 3 soft taps. Not behind. Ahead. From the road. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I looked down. At the edge of the asphalt, a single elongated depression pressed into the surface. Not a footprint. Not an animal track. A perfect oval with no edges. Just a smooth, heavy indentation. Fresh. The radio whispered again. "Mercer, don't move." It left the tower for a reason. The mountain doesn't let everything stay buried. The trees rustled. Something shifted. Too close. And the road, my one escape, was no longer empty.